Hey guys, cut it out. We're about to start.
It was Hannah's fault. She decided to put the backup mic on the top shelf.
I was only doing what Bo told me to do. She's the one supervising the whole thing.
That is such a white girl thing to say.
What would you know about being a white girl, Coda, considering you're a guy? Besides, it doesn't matter what race and gender you have anyway.
Yeah, everyone here should get equal blame for the accident. Coda for being a whiner baby, Bo for giving the instructions that led to me putting the mic on the top shelf, and me for actually following directions for once.
Okay, that sounds fair. Hey, wait, I'm not.
Anyway, what just happened actually has a little bit to do with today's podcast topic. We're talking about one of the major events in history where discrimination because of race and gender was a huge issue. Do you guys know what I'm talking about?
Let me guess, the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s?
You guessed it!
Hey all you podcast listeners, welcome to our show, Three Girls and a Guy. Today's topic, as Shayna said earlier, is about the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. Coda, why don't you tell them a little background information about this controversial event?
Sure thing, Bo. The Civil Rights Movement, as well as other events in history, is a repercussion of the Civil War in 1861 through 1865, where the northern states, Oregon, California,
Holla!
Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, Kansas, Wisconsin, Illinois, Michigan, Indiana,
Jones!
Kentucky,
Fried chicken!
West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey,
Yo, I'm from Jersey!
Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York.
Broadway!
Okay, that's it. Are you guys actually going to let me give the info to our listeners or not? That's what I thought. The northern states, Oregon, California, Missouri, Iowa, Minnesota, Kansas, Wisconsin, Illinois, Michigan, Indiana, Kentucky, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Maine were pitted against the southern states, Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, North Carolina, which is very ironic, and Virginia.
Good. Now why are they fighting?
The northern and southern states were fighting for several reasons. Some historians say they were fighting because of issue of slavery, some say it was because of the difference in culture, and others say it was because the separate kinds of economic that were to blame, and others say it was because of discrimination of race and gender. Like we said before, there are many different reasons, and the true reason is still being debated about today.
There were many things that took place during the 4 years of the Civil War. I took the initiative to find the ones that to me have the most significance in alignment with our civil rights movement topic. In December of 1863, President Lincoln introduced a plan for Reconstruction to prepare to bring the nation back together as soon as possible, for at this point the nation was in the middle of full-out war. This plan consisted of restoring property that had been taken back to the South, a new state government being formed, and when the South was readmitted, they could make their own plan to deal with the newly free slaves so long as their freedom wasn't compromised.
Towards the end of the war, in January of 1865, Congress proposed an amendment to the Constitution to abolish slavery, which was passed, but wasn't introduced to the states until that December.
Then, in April of 1866, after the Civil War ended, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 was passed and enacted by Congress, which declared all people born in the United States to be citizens, regardless of race, color, or previous condition.
Next, the 14th Amendment was passed in July of 1868 and stated that all persons born and naturalized in the United States were citizens. It also dealt with topics such as holding states accountable to uphold these rules, due process of law, and others.
The Civil War and its coming to an end sparked a large chain of events where mainly African Americans, but other races as well, started to realize their worth as people of the United States. The search for equality had finally been pushed forward. So far forward that it continued into the next century as an event called the Civil Rights Movement, also known as the Second Awakening, which is what today's podcast is all about.
The Civil Rights Movement of 1950s to 1960s was a time in when the South, African Americans received unequal treatment because of their race and or skin color, and thus decided that they want equal treatment and rights with their white brethren. The two major preluding the movement were in August of 1955, Emmett Till, an African American teenager, was beaten and killed by two white men in Mississippi while visiting their family.
The second event was in December of 1955 when Rosa Parks refused to give up her bus seat for a white man in Montgomery, Alabama. She was then arrested by Montgomery police, which was responded to by African Americans who boycotted buses. They would walk to and from places instead of riding the bus.
The treatment of blacks in these two events made African Americans very angry and very upset. So upset, in fact, that they were now willing to fight for the anti-discrimination and equality they so craved and deserved. This led to the spark of the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement.
The movement was led by Martin Luther King Jr., a pastor from Montgomery, Alabama at the time, who was also African American. He believed that the movement should go forward without violence towards others in order to achieve change. A possible reason they were protesting because of violence and that the inequality and discrimination of races of people other than the pure whites needed to change.
But just because the protesters weren't violent doesn't mean other people weren't. During the protests, law enforcement would use clubs, fire hoses, tear gas, and whips to break up protests of violence and nonviolence alike.
It wasn't just the police who were inflicting violence either. Members from civilian populations and perhaps some law enforcement members formed a group called the KKK or Ku Klux Klan. Dating back to the Civil War era, this group was known and is still known today as one of the most terrifying and violent groups of that era. They would reform religious gatherings, which included burning down buildings and vehicles and terrorizing pro-movement citizens.
Despite the KKK and their almost insufferable treatment by the white community, it didn't stop Martin Luther King Jr. and his followers from achieving their goal. They pushed onward and kept organizing protests and rallies across the nation.
On May 29, 1961, President Kennedy announces that he is applying the Interstate Commerce Commission in order to enact stricter regulations and fine for buses and facilities that refuse to integrate black and white people. This commission was one of the first steps toward equality for the African American race.
Then, in November and December of 1961, the Albany movement took place. The civil rights activists participated in protests, marches, and meetings in Albany, Georgia. The protesters remained civil and nonviolent, even though they were frequently beaten and arrested upon sight. This event led to what is considered to be one of the most moving and influential events of the entire civil rights movement.
This most influential and moving event of the civil rights movement took place on August 28, 1963. The black community, as well as black sympathizers, followed Martin Luther King Jr. on a march to Washington, D.C., where the people who gathered there at the end of the march came from different towns, cities, and even states. Some 250,000 people total were there and came to listen to Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous speech, "I Have a Dream." The speech portrayed King's wish that the United States would become a country where everyone was equal and no one was discriminated against.
Next, sometime in 1963, King, the SNCC, and the SCLC organized protests to challenge segregation in Birmingham, Alabama. This was met with arrests later on and the use of violence upon protesters. Still, the civil rights activists remained peaceful and focused on their goal to end segregation.
Then the country was hit with a devastating blow when on November 22, 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated. His successor, President Johnson, then used the nation's anger and sorrow from the assassination into a way to ensure the civil rights legislation was put into effect, which was the idea of the movement being widespread across the nation from 1860s to present day, and is important to the history of the U.S.
Later on, about 8 months later, on July 2, 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed. The act banned discrimination in employment and public places. This was a big step in succeeding to end the segregation and discrimination of African Americans because blacks were now free to go to whatever public place they wished freely, and that was just part of the beginning.
The civil rights movement of the 50s to 60s ended in 1968, and the result of these events within the movement led to many acts being passed during the movement and after it. For example, the Civil Rights Acts of 1957, 1964, and 1968, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In some ways, these acts prevented African Americans from being discriminated against in every aspect of everyday life, such as voting, or what places they could go to, or even buying a house and getting a job.
Most people believe the civil rights movement ended in the year 1968, when in fact it is still going on today. Our country works every day as a unified combination of government and civilians to make sure our beloved United States remains fair and unbiased, and it is our duties as citizens to do so.
That's all the time we have for today, but we hope you guys enjoyed the podcast and learned some really great things about the Civil War movement and learned some things from it as well. We hope you guys listen again soon. This has been Three Girls and a Guy with Bo, Hannah, Shayna, and Coda. Our Lord, have an awesome day.